Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at the Great Dismal Swamp. And to do that, we have brought in Dr. Misti Harper, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at University of North Carolina, Pembroke.
Yeah, and Ray, some people would say that some of our podcasts might be dismal, but this one is going to be extremely entertaining and it's very engaging. And I'm really excited about it because I grew up on the northern tip of the Great Dismal Swamp, and I remember canoeing down it and just thinking, wow, what a just a marvelous place full of just all kinds of brush and insects, and just it was really just a wild place. And I had no idea that I was canoeing into history. That is something that is absolutely fascinating to study. And I am really excited for our listeners to hear from Dr. Harper and all that she shares as it relates to the history that is still being discovered right there in the Great Dismal Swamp, located the North Carolina Virginia border.
Yeah, and with that, we'll go to the interview. Enjoy. Okay, Dr. Harper, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Shepard and Dr. Carroll.
Yeah. We're looking forward to talking to you today about free communities in the Great Dismal Swamp. Before we get into the Great Dismal Swamps and start talking about all of this, explain to our listeners, maybe for those who are not from North Carolina or Virginia, what exactly is the Great Dismal Swamp and what caused you to get interested in it?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. Because for myself, as a historian and as a researcher, this is still relatively new as a topic and new as a region for me because I am not from North Carolina myself. I'm from Arkansas. So, the Great Dismal Swamp, as a geographic expanse, is a massive swampy area that straddles the North Carolina and Virginia border on the East Coast. Whenever European colonizers first happened upon this massive land area, it covered roughly the state of Delaware. That's how large this was. Now, over the centuries, it has since been drained to less than a quarter of its original size, but it is still an incredibly large body of water that continues to hide all kinds of communities that once dwelled there, and that still covers a massive expanse that straddles two states. So that's the area where we're talking about. It is exactly as it sounds. And in my research, what I found was that dismal actually is the term for swamp in the English language. So I suppose before dismal became associated with ideas like dark, decrepit, depressing, right? It was used to refer to these geographic regions. So I found that to be interesting, and also interesting in the way that the English colonizers who happened upon it described it, because it seems that they used that word because they were intimidated by that geography. And they wanted to turn it into something that would make profitable tobacco land because it's right there in the heart of the Chesapeake. But because it was such a taxing and laborious venture, whenever they couldn't assert dominance easily, then that land had to become something foreboding and something associated with terrible qualities because it wouldn't bend to their will. So that's the area we're talking about. That's the kind of geography we're talking about. I think you asked me one more question and I've forgotten it in the explanation of the first two. So,
Yeah, it's just what got you interested in the Great
oh,
Dismal Swamp?
yeah. Well, funny story. So my interest in the Dismal Swamp is genuine. but I was rather looking for ideas that would prove my worth to my university here at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, because I was hired here as a tenure track professor, and I was really interested in finding work that interested me as a historian, but that also proved to my administration why they should keep me. So I was looking for ways that I could make my natural interests that they hired me for work for our local region. And fortunately, there's an overwhelming abundance of incredible history to this state that lent itself to my expertise, and that, I have been enamored of and enmeshed in ever since. So a little bit of political expediency with a whole lot of genuine, wow, what is this? So
And as you talk about the Dismal Swamp, and we recognize that part of this research is understanding the people groups that found their way to the Dismal Swamp. And so I wondered if you could speak just for a minute about what life was like for enslaved people during the time as they made their way to the Dismal Swamp, and maybe also because you mentioned the word dismal and kind of what it did mean and then what it turned out to mean. So, how was the Dismal Swamp maybe a place of hardship, but also a place of refuge?
that is such a fantastic question, and it's been fascinating to study this work and to especially study some of the archaeological work that has been undertaken, in particular by Dr. Daniel Sayers, who is up at American University in DC. He's really been the spearhead for the recent flourishing of the area, not of the concept of maroons. That has long been, those have long been a very well documented and studied people amongst Black historians, especially. But it's really Dr. Sayers who began to uncover so much of the depth of how this region was a refuge, in particular for African American people in the Chesapeake region, but also to areas that lie well beyond Virginia and North Carolina. So I think it's interesting that at any given point, there were possibly thousands of formerly enslaved people living in disparate communities throughout this vast region, because it was an incredibly difficult space to learn how to survive in and then to figure out a way to thrive. The swamp, in parts, as I understand it, is incredibly deep. There are quicksand pits throughout. There are also sandbars where, if you are trying to canoe or kayak or float any other sort of vessel through, you can very easily get stuck and have real difficulty dislodging yourself. Those are just some of the precarious parts of this very dark water, right? Then there is the vegetation itself, which apparently is so thick in parts that it basically blocks out the sun, and it's incredibly dark once you are into specific expanses of the swamp region. There are all kinds of animals and flora and fauna that is hazardous to human habitation, that you can certainly learn how to make work for you as foodstuffs or as shelter, but initially that process is exceedingly dangerous. One of the
Mhm.
fascinating things that I learned is that apparently snakes in the depths of Dismal Swamp behave something like snakes of the Amazon, where they hang like vines from trees. So, yes, exactly that
That's
reaction,
that
right?
does not sound like a pleasant place.
No, no, right. And nevertheless, enslaved people, scores of whom were recently arrived African laborers. So these are people who are having to learn the geography of everything about the Chesapeake in real time. They were willing to risk surviving in this swamp, a place that they would also have to learn to navigate rather than endure the realities of being an enslaved person. One of the fascinating parts about these communities is that there were temporary Maroon communities, so temporary people who would liberate themselves for short periods of time. They would keep one foot in the enslaved world and one foot in this quasi kind of free world, effectively in a way that we would think of today as like blowing off steam from work, taking a temporary respite and then going back to either get a secure food source, be nearer to family, or a whole host of reasons, that are these individuals' own that would send them back to their life on these labor camps. But hundreds, perhaps even thousands more chose a life of semi-permanence to complete permanence if they could, because the swamp was better than bondage. It was better than the constant monotonous violence of not only having your day ordered, but also of living under some incredibly brutal and rigid rules so that you could constantly produce wealth that you could never share in. And even beyond those labor conditions, socially, you were marked not just as an enslaved person, but as a permanent alien in this society, no matter how long you lived here, no matter how many generations of a family or a community you produced and then reproduced. You were constantly reminded that legally, politically, and socially, you were never included in the community politic. You could be in the swamp. You could be free in the swamp, free of abuse, free of that kind of labor, free of burden, and you could find belonging in this space. So I think it says something really profound that so many people chose the swamp over the proverbial devil that they knew.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking about that is I've read somewhere that when researchers look at runaway slaves
Mhm.
in early American stuff, it really didn't matter whether they were coming from large plantations or small farms. Didn't matter whether they were coming from places where they were treated quote unquote well, or whether
Yeah.
they were coming from places where they were treated really poorly. The runaways were pretty much consistent. It was something that every slaveholder had to face. These people running away, trying to find their freedoms. And I guess when you look at a place like the Great Dismal Swamp, this is a place they could go to that a lot of the whites, maybe slave hunters, are not going to go into.
That's a really appealing fact for so many of these people, is that while there certainly were teams of so-called slave catchers
Mm-hmm.
organized, sometimes at the behest of enslavers themselves, they would sometimes take direct part in these policing raids to try to recover these people. You had to be made of pretty stern stuff to be a part of these raids, or in the case of, say, a really wealthy landowner, to risk your own skin to go and try to recapture these people. Because, especially amongst the permanent communities, there was an expectation of martial physical resistance that if your community, if your family or yourself as an individual were threatened, you would fight to the death to protect your freedom, to protect that of your community, to protect that of the island communities that were scattered throughout the swamps. And this was something that, after the Civil War and after slavery is abolished, as these people begin to come out of these swamp communities and they shared their experience of what it was like to live in these communities for an extended period of time, or in the case of some people, they lived their entire lives in this swamp and only reemerged after abolition. And they talked about that, how it was expected that you would fight to the death to resist being recaptured or impressed into slavery. And this was something that was also understood by the white community. white accounts of the swamp, especially on the periphery, are so fear-filled when you read them. They talk about how well armed they believe the people who live in the swamps to be, and they talk about how vicious, in their estimation, those people were. It's like, well, yeah, I guess so, right? I suppose so. If
Yeah.
you understand on any level what the reality of slavery was like. And that is something too that I think is so telling whenever you look at white accounts, is that there is this tacit admission of just how barbaric slavery is, even if an individual enslaver is not as abusive as, say, a Simon Legree is,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
No, it's incredibly revealing, both white fear and black power whenever you look at that dynamic in that way.
One of the things kind of you mentioned earlier is we were talking about enslaved, but you also mentioned the Maroon communities, and maybe something for our listeners, as we have a wide variety of different listeners that come on. History you didn't know but should. And so I wondered if maybe you could speak for a little bit about what those Maroon communities were, and how did they survive in the midst of this as well.
Sure. So, for listeners who are not familiar with the term maroon, that is actually the English corruption of the word cimarron that the Spanish colonizers used to refer to African people who escaped labor camps in the Caribbean and throughout Central and South America. And cimarron translates loosely to savage, wild, uncontrollable. When the English heard that term, they heard it and concentrated on the end of that word. And so then they referred to self-emancipated people in English spaces as the Maroons. Maroon communities are incredibly well documented throughout the Caribbean, in large part because the Caribbean islands are so much smaller than the landmass of the United States, and also because there were higher concentrations of African and African descent folks on those spaces. Maroon communities throughout the Caribbean were typically very large, and because of their numbers, they could survive virtually into perpetuity and thrive and had, generally speaking, more and better access to external resources that they needed to continue their survival. American maroon communities are not like that. And that's part of why there's been such an explosion of interest in the Great Dismal Swamp and in maroon communities, because insofar as historians and archaeologists can tell, the Great Dismal Swamp sheltered the biggest maroon community in North America proper. So the way that we have pieced together how these folks were surviving, it's really interesting because it seems to lie in large part in African gender norms, with women performing, with girls and women performing the kind of work that they likely would have performed had they or their ancestors not been stolen from West African communities in the first place. One of the cultural norms amongst a lot of West African societies where enslaved people were kidnapped from, was that girls and women were the primary farmers. They were the primary food producers. They did not have the cultural stigmatism that developed in Europe and that later developed in North America, where women didn't perform that work or where that work was assigned a masculine sort of gender identity. And of course, that's not to say that European women didn't farm. We know that they did, but we also know too that it's predominantly men who were associated with husbandry, right? That's where that word comes from. It
Yeah.
literally means farmer, right? That was very much considered masculine oriented work. That is not true in Western Africa. And very much the food, the production of it, and the dispersal of it, that was women's and girls' gendered labor. So you have these communities where I contend, and there are other historians who also believe in this theory, that it is women and girls and that labor that is helping to sustain these communities. Whereas black men who are in these spaces, they are hunters, they are finding game, they are hunting down wild pigs, they are hunting down alligators and reptiles and bears to keep up their diets. Together, these people are building what is possible on these islands that range in size. Some of them are as wide as a football field. Others could support as many as 100 people in a relatively small community, but significant to that size that I just named. And it's really a kind of communal effort that propels these maroons in spaces where you do have significant communes of them gathering. It's because there are not the stigmas of gender that disrupt shared labor patterns, I think, that enables them in part to survive. And a large part of it, too, is that these folks are learning from the indigenous communities that have called the swamp home for millennia. Some of the archaeological discoveries that have been made in the Dismal Swamp place human habitation there going back all the way to like 13,000 years ago. Those people don't leave the swamp just because colonizers come. In some cases, indigenous communities that are related to, say, the Powhatan, who are on the extreme east coast of Virginia, they're driven even further backward into these communities. And so they are encountering, their descendants are encountering these African folks who are coming in and they are sharing knowledge and they are making space for one another. And there is evidence of a kind of trade and barter system that is happening in these swamps. It's actually, whenever you look at it and you think about the era that it is and the way that these people are having to create out of no kind of civilization as we would think about it, it's really a very sophisticated network that is happening in between all of these different communities and the different configurations of Maroon people who are back in these areas.
Yeah.
Something, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. You're fine. Go ahead.
To say, and something that's also crucial, and it can be sort of hard to remember this if you get lost in the romance of these, rugged, these ultimate American figures, right? These very rugged individualists making a way out of no way, right? Is that it's very important that there are some Maroons who do have at least a foot still in the colonial community because that was often a necessary lifeline to getting items like ready-made clothing, medicine, necessities that you couldn't necessarily always create on your own or grow or repair if you were miles back into this really difficult terrain that's hard for anyone to traverse. So being able to make connections with folks who are some of the temporary maroons is also essential, and we shouldn't forget about those folks.
It's amazing. When I think of romantic pictures, one thing that does not come to mind is walking and living under snakes hanging out of trees. That's horror movie stuff right there. But I wanted to go back to something you said about the gender roles because I know that this is something I've seen that you've talked about before, and it struck me as you were talking that division of labor was also very common among Native Americans prior
Mhm.
to the arrival of Europeans, that
Yes.
women were doing a lot of the farming work while men were doing more of the hunting and gathering and stuff like that. So leadership in these communities, governance in these communities, was it women taking the head in some of these maroon communities, or were men sort of leading it? Do we know?
I have not found evidence yet, and I've not read anything from historians like Brent Morris or Sylviane Dueff or and anyone who is much more deeply versed in the entire concept of Maroon than I am as a
Mhm.
relative newcomer to this history. I have yet to read anything that really focuses on a governmental structure that existed in the way that you're asking.
Hmm.
It really seems like, insofar as research has proven, that these folks were really just arranged in a kind of loose confederation of communes. There's not really the sort of government structure that we would imagine with elected officials, or even, what you imagine indigenous communities all over the world having, where there is a singular figure, or even, a collection of figures who are making anything approaching policy. That doesn't seem to have existed based on what research is available now. We might find evidence of that at some point, but so far I've not read anything, at least for North America. There are instances of, you know, some government structure in, say, amongst the Jamaican Maroons. That's, Queen Nanny of the Jamaican Maroons, who leads this really incredible rebellion down there in the 17th or 18th century, I believe it is. She was the undisputed leader of the Maroon uprising in that particular community, but I've not found any kind of parallel that approaches that for the GDS, at least not yet. So,
Okay.
yeah.
I, I want to go to having grown up on the northern tip of this area. One of the things, and that's been many years ago, but one of the things that I started seeing before I left Virginia to come to North Carolina was a lot of development and a
Mhm.
lot of deforestation. And basically you just mentioned it earlier that you had this large expanse of the Dismal Swamp that is now getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So I want to kind of take the history of the research and the life of what took place at the Dismal Swamp and tie it into current society today. And I guess the question that I would ask is, how can we today honor the legacy and the lives of those who use this community, this area, as a place of refuge, as a place of living? How can we keep that tradition alive? You're doing it through your research, but how can students, how can adults, how can people who might not be familiar with the Great Dismal Swamp, I guess how do we honor and preserve the history of those individuals in that area?
That's a really wonderful question. So one of the facets of Sayer's work that I appreciate so much is that there is a very strong environmental emphasis to what he is doing, with his students, and what he's advocating for as far as the protection of these historical sites goes. And of course, in the last 25, 30 years, there's been a far more heightened awareness about the environmental impact on the region as a geographical jewel itself, but then also as more and more archaeological evidence of these Maroon communities, of indigenous communities that predate African and African American presence in this space go, there has been a concerted effort to protect this space as, a site of historical resistance. And I think the way that, ordinary folks who learn about this space can participate is in the same way that you would fight for, the protection of your local parks, your local forests, the places that you call home, is to make it political for yourself. If what you're asking is how can we preserve the history and the integrity of what is left of the swamp, I think the answer is putting pressure on local, state, and federal officials to honor this region and to center this history, and also to listen to the descendants of the residents of the swamp themselves, indigenous communities that continue to live in that area. Certainly, the descendants of the Maroons themselves. There is a wonderful historian called Eric Shepherd, who is a descendant of Moses Grandy, who provided a narrative of what like was life in the Great Dismal Swamp. And it's actually digitized online through UNC Chapel Hill called Documenting the South. His name is Moses Grandy, and he provides one of the most full accounts that historians have of people who actually lived, worked, and had relationships with other interior maroons for the swamp. I think connecting with families like Eric Shepherd is essential in this work because those are the people that often still are in possession of the best oral histories passed down from those survivors who began to come out of the swamp after the Civil War. Listening to them, and then also too listening to the voices of people like yourself, people who have generational ties to this land, who have watched, for decades now, the disintegration and the development and, the invasion of corporate interests into these spaces. I think that we all have a responsibility that we can put towards a total effort of protecting this land. And in doing that, then you do protect and honor the history. And then you do protect and, maintain the integrity of what is left of this space, right? I think that there are a lot of ways to answer that question.
Yeah, and it's so important to preserve these sites, not just simply for their aestheticness, not just simply for the environment and the wildlife that calls it home, but also for the historical knowledge that we get from this, that we're pulling from these sites. Because if there's an old song, they paid paradise and put up a parking lot or something to that effect. And if they do that, that's you're losing so much.
You really are. And, I mean, for people who are skeptics of what we're talking about here, I mean, I think probably a great way to frame it is that if we lose the Great Dismal Swamp, we lose something that overwhelmed even the tenacity of a man like George Washington. Because it did. Like this was one of the great failures of Washington's life. He wanted to live to see the development of the Dismal Swamp,
Right.
but it defeated him at every turn. I mean, and isn't something that, could resist George Washington worth preserving for that very fact, right? This truly is a place that was and remains in so many ways utterly untamable, right? I mean, I don't know. That might seem kind of like a convoluted way to pitch preservation. But I mean, I think that there's something really cool in that. The first president of the United States could not bring this space to heal.
Mhm.
That means it's pretty damn special, right?
Yep.
So,
Absolutely. And my last question to you was going to be, and I think you just answered it so wonderfully. What's one thing you wish more people understood about the Great Dismal Swamp and the people who live there?
gosh.
That's a tough one.
With everything that is happening in our current environmental climate and in our current political and social climate, I feel like that's going to shade my answer quite a lot because what strikes me every time I come back to work on this project is I don't know that there's anything quite so American as the Great Dismal Swamp. It, for me, recommends so much of those qualities that we think are the most ideal about the American spirit. Going into a place that is perhaps alien to you and not only finding a way to survive, but finding a way to thrive and to thrive with that land and to thrive there in freedom and equity and plenty. for historians, for any sort of student of the Great Dismal Swamp, no matter the field, I think that that's one of the things that is most intoxicating about this space is that so many indigenous people before them, and then later on the Maroons, and the handfuls of colonials who, for whatever reason, decided they did not want to live in mainstream Eurocentric society, who also made this swamp and its interior home, if you listened to the land and to people who had successfully made homes in this space, you could live in complete comfort. You could. There were food resources, shelter resources. If you understood how to live in a share-based economy, I mean, and not to romanticize a place where alligators and snakes from trees are ever-present threats, but that sounds pretty incredible than grinding out a 12 to 16-hour workday for little to no pay, no matter who you are, and paying it to some sort of feudal overlord. I mean, the Great Dismal Swamp at its best represents like all of the most wonderful ideals about this country. And I think that that is what I would share with people who have never heard of this place before.
Yeah, I want to thank you so much for the way that you shared the passion that comes from this project that you have, but it ties into the passion that we should have every day for the life that we live, because truly the story that you are telling is the story that's been told for generation after generation after generation, is that even in places of hardship, you can find opportunities to thrive. It's what you make of the land. It's what you make of the people. It's what you make of the situation. And if there's anything that we can go back and look at, it is that these people who did migrate and find their way to the Great Dismal Swamp, knowing what it held, they made something beautiful out of it. And so that does lead that there is hope, that there is opportunity, but it requires a community of people who believe in hope, who believe in opportunity, because one person in the Dismal Swamp was not going to make it. Rather, it required a community of individuals, as you've mentioned, of all sexes, to be able to come together, the males with their task, the females with their task. But at the end of the day, the task was preserving humanity. It was sharing an example. And so I want to thank you for bringing this research to light. You know, Dr. Shepard said before we got on of how people had the opportunity to hear your presentation are still talking about the passion that you brought to this particular project. And I, for one, am grateful for people like you who find these nuggets of history. And you want to make sure that they are shared with as many people as possible, not just for historical sake, but what we can do with it in the right here, in the right now, in the particular culture that we have. So for me, thank you. It has been a pleasure hearing from you, and I can't wait. I'll ask the question when you're going to go ahead and publish that book that you're working on this, because my gracious, when people, I know me, that this is something you've gotten me. I've written down several names and several things that I want to go back and I want to research and I want to study some more of. And so I look forward to following you and to hearing more about this project, as I know our listeners do. And I also know that you said in our discussion that this was one of the projects that you, when you come back to this project. So, you know, maybe as we take a minute to prepare to close, maybe you just take a brief moment and highlight some of the other areas of research that you're interested in. So maybe how people can do what I want to do, which is I just like want to be a fan of yours. I just want to, I mean, you're really cool. And so, you know, and I mean, this is the bow tie guy saying that, but I mean, I'm just saying it's just like really cool. And I want to follow it, but I'm sure that some of our others want to follow too. And maybe some of the other research and some of the other projects you have. So maybe just take a minute and, share kind of what life's throwing at you.
Well, just first, thank you for incredibly kind words and your graciousness. And I appreciate you and Dr. Shepard so much for giving me these opportunities. I sincerely do. I mean that. I feel very humbled right now. Um, so I get a bit excited. And I rarely ever only have one idea percolating at a time. In addition to this project, I am also currently working on a project about a fellow called George Applewhite, who was one of the black members of the Lowry gang that fought the Lowry War right here in Pembroke, back whenever it was widely known by outsiders as Scuffletown. And the reason that I'm focusing on George Applewhite is because I immediately was captivated by the relationship, the triracial relationships in the state of North Carolina whenever I was hired here. And in researching UNCP, whenever I put in my application, I was intrigued. I was like, I have never heard of the Lumbee. I didn't know that these folks existed. And I come from an indigenous family. I mean, my aunt, my cousins, they are Diné Navajo. And I was really embarrassed. I was like, I had no idea that there were still indigenous folks living anywhere in the Southeast because that history, after the Trail of Tears just really cuts off in most tellings of the US narrative, right? So with the exception of the Eastern Band of Cherokee over in the Smokies, I had no idea. And then to have the good grace to be hired here has allowed me access to learning more and learning specifically about this vital, I don't want to call them an origin story because the Lumbee have been here since time immemorial, but this story that's really integral to their identity. And then to find that there are not just Black participants in that story, but that they too are also Lumbee. What are these questions of identity and belonging and shaping this place that still need to be told and with attention focused on people who had these dual identities? So that's a project that I'm working on. And then I also have a really personal labor of love happening. I did some genealogy research in the last 5 years and discovered that not only were my own ancestors colonizers who came in through the Chesapeake region of Virginia and also this exact part of North Carolina, but one of my ancestors was an enslaved woman to other ancestors of mine. And I've been able to trace her story from Virginia in oh which county is it? Oh bless. It's the one that virtually everybody who came into Johnston County from Virginia came from. I forget the exact name of the county, but
Mhm.
she was a part of that exodus of folks who were leaving Virginia after the Revolutionary War. And of course, she didn't have a choice. She was going with, my five times great grandfather, right? So that was that relationship. But I was able to trace her trajectory all the way into Louisiana, where I thought all of my family was from. And so I'm trying to piece together more of her story. And I'm not sure what I'll be able to make of that in a professional sense, but that is something that I would like to do to honor her, even if it's just a paper that I write. Her name was Sally. I've learned that. And and so I am trying to figure out how, as a professional historian, how I can honor and learn more about my own grandmother.
Well, Dr. Harper, thank you so much for joining us here today on History You Didn't Know But Should. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this as much as I have, and I know as much as Chris has. And we really thank you for coming on to the podcast.
Oh, thank y'all so much for having me.
I hope our listeners have enjoyed the interview we did there with Dr. Misti Harper. Chris, I learned a lot, and I'm hoping our listeners did as well.
Yeah, and I think it goes to show that there's still a lot of investigation and research to be done. And one of the things that I found was very interesting is she was talking about what it is that she's passionate about. And I think that there's a lot to be said about finding your passion and then researching it. She mentioned about her genealogy that she was doing as far as it relates to her family. She discussed, of course, the Great Dismal Swamp, but what is it that our listeners are thinking about is their passion? What is something that they're interested in? And it goes to show that you can just have this idea, and the internet is awash of full of information. I loved how some of these things are now being digitized to where you can go online and research. I know I wrote down several names and several topics that I want to go and do a deeper dive into. And so I think that she helped open the gateway for more research, but also just a beautiful look at history that is nearby.
Yeah, absolutely. I learned so much about the Great Dismal Swamp and maroons, and it was just a fascinating interview. And I do hope our listeners enjoyed this interview and other interviews we have done in recent past with other guests and interviews we're going to be doing in the future.
Hope that our listeners have enjoyed this podcast. And as always, you can find all of our other podcasts available on YouTube, Spotify, and all the other places where you can find history you didn't know but should. So tune in for another great episode next week. And until then, I'm Chris.
And I'm Ray.
Have a great day.